we welcome today Professor Mark Diesendorf. Mark has had wide experience in renewable energies, in nuclear, in energy technology assessments and energy policy over the many years. He's also worked heavily in sustainability and ecological economics, so he comes with a huge amount of experience. He has a Bachelor of Science in Physics from Sydney Uni. He's got a PhD in Applied Mathematics. At the moment he's an Honorary Associate Professor at the University of New South Wales in Sydney, and in this position he teaches, researches and consults in the fields of sustainable energy, energy policy, the theory of sustainability, ecological economics and socially just development. So a lot of areas he's covering in this area in his work at the moment. He's also been, and that was an interesting fact for me to know, that he was a principal researcher in the CSIRO in the 1980s when things were working and people were starting to move towards this. Okay, and I think one of his ethos, and you'll correct me if I'm not right about this, is that science and tech should be used to serve the community and to help us live better. And I think that's a really important thing to remember. So interesting, especially for this area with our wind farms, he was a co-founder and president of the original Australasian Wind Energy Association. So I thought that was pretty interesting with all our wonderful windmills out around Crookwell and Gullen and so on. Okay, now his has many publications. The latest one is The Path to a Sustainable Civilization, which he's brought along a few copies, discounted, but he's written many books around the thinking about sustainability and living a lot better than we do at the moment, and a way that is sustainable into the future. Okay, so I'm going to be quiet now because you want to hear from Professor Mark Diesendorf. Welcome.
Well, thank you very much, Penny, and thank you very much to the Citizens Climate Lobby for inviting me. I came down from Sydney this afternoon, and the worst part of the journey was trying to get out of Sydney, actually. It was pretty terrible. Yeah, so I was originally a physicist, a theoretical physicist, and I got interested in energy. And the more I worked on energy, the more I realised that energy is such a broad topic. It can't be dealt with within science alone or science and engineering alone. We have to think about economics and political science and law. It's really an interdisciplinary area. So gradually I broadened out, and now, and then the more I worked on energy, and I particularly worked on renewable energy scenarios and the energy transition. And I started working on the energy transition before the phrase energy transition actually existed, 47 years ago. So you can see I'm getting older, and but I soon realised that you can't actually solve the whole energy problem with technological change in energy alone. Other issues come up, and I'll try and bring this out. And I'm not sure if I did the right thing in bringing a slideshow, but anyway, I'll see how it goes, but I'm keen that we'll have lots of discussion at the end of the presentation. So, okay, let's see what happens. Well, some of you might have heard people who don't want to recognise that we're facing climate change right now. You might have heard them say, we've always had droughts and heat waves and wildfires and floods. What's new? Well, what's new is that huge floods and events that we had once every 50 years, we're now having once every 5 years or 10 years. The frequency has increased and the intensity has increased. And there's no doubt that we are experiencing climate change now. And the main contributor to climate change is burning fossil fuels, coal, oil, and what the propaganda calls natural gas, but I prefer to call fossil gas, because that's what it is, a fossil fuel. So we are now facing this, and people in many rural areas of Australia now are really suffering, losing their homes, whether it's in the fires or the floods, and yet, if somebody dares say anything in the middle of one of these horrible events, they're attacked for somehow being political or so on. I'm talking about science, and if politicians want to take positions, that's their problem. Okay. So the burning of fossil fuels plays a huge role, sorry, am I standing in the way, in climate change. It's most of climate change, but also deforestation and large-scale agriculture have also contributions to greenhouse gas emissions and to global climate change. Now, if we decide finally to be serious in this country about dealing with fossil fuels, we can solve so many problems at once. Climate change is probably the most urgent, the most major of the problems, but air pollution is a real issue, and it's killing lots of people in this country and around the world. Air pollution from burning fossil fuels. That top right picture are the lungs of a teenager in the city of Los Angeles who was sadly killed in a car accident. That black stuff on the lungs is the result of air pollution in Los Angeles. He was a non-smoker, okay? This is all air pollution, and it's not due to smoking. Air pollution, water pollution, respiratory diseases, land degradation. There's an open-cut coal mine in the bottom. But if there happened to be a tiny wind turbine in the background, you'd hear certain politicians screaming, ugly wind turbines, you know, the horrors. But look at that. And most of the coal mine developers, they're supposed to do remedial work. In most cases, they don't, and it's left to taxpayers in the state governments to actually do it. Energy insecurity. Europe is regretting terribly that they became so dependent on Russian fossil fuels, particularly oil and gas. With the Ukraine war, they are making a fantastic transition to renewables, but they can't do it overnight. So they are in deep trouble. Australia is still highly dependent on oil for transportation. We have about 1 month's storage of oil in this country at any time. A previous government has very thoughtfully created some kind of store in the United States, which we would never have access to anyway. And this is no joke. If transportation breaks down before most of it becomes electrified, people will starve in the cities because food will not be delivered into the cities. Okay, this appears to be a complicated diagram, but it's really very simple. Down the left-hand side are the 3 ways we use energy. We use it in the form of electricity, which is running this slideshow, and the lighting and all the rest of it. We use it for transportation, which is mostly oil, and we use it for heating our homes in industrial heat, which is mostly fossil gas. And we have the solutions to most of these problems technologically already. We can transform our electricity system to 100% renewables, and South Australia is right on track. It should get there in 2 or 3 years already, and it has no hydroelectric potential. It's doing fantastically. In transportation, we know the obvious solutions. In urban transportation, better public transport, electric cars, better pedestrian areas, high-speed rail so that Goulburn can be joined to Sydney and Canberra and Melbourne. And I mean, there are countries that, like Taiwan, who are far ahead of us, who already have high-speed rail. Supposedly third world countries, well, although Taiwan isn't really a third world country. The main area that we still need to develop technologically is air transport. We can have electric aircraft going short distances, like from Goulburn to Sydney, no problem. And they're already on the market. But for longer distance flights, the batteries become too heavy. So what we need is to produce a gaseous fuel or a liquid fuel using renewable energy. It might be hydrogen or ammonia, something like that, or a biofuel. So we still need advances in that red area for air transport and sea transport, and hydrogen also for some industrial processes. Non-electrical heat, again, we have electric heat pumps, reverse cycle air conditioners, that's an electric heat pump. We can do it. So already we're in a position where we can make a transition to mostly electricity and mostly renewable electricity fairly quickly on a timescale for the electricity industry. But the main point of this slide is that electricity is going to play a much greater role in the future. We won't be burning fuels. We'll be producing renewable electricity. So I won't go through this slide in detail, but the main point is that the energy transition that any energy experts recommend, provided they are not employed by the fossil fuel industry or the nuclear industry, is renewable energy plus electrification of almost everything, plus energy efficiency, because we're still very energy inefficient. I'm sure there are many houses in Goulburn that are not adequately insulated, for example, as they are in Sydney. And another factor, which is fairness, that as we make a transition in the energy sector, people who work in jobs associated with the fossil fuel industry will need to be helped to make their transition, whether it is retraining or relocation or pensions, or governments creating more jobs, more green jobs in areas that were previously dependent on fossil fuels like coal. For example, in the Hunter Valley of New South Wales, the Latrobe Valley of Victoria. Okay, so when you read the propaganda of those who do not wish to see this energy transition take place, you will, I get the impression when I read it, is they're pretending that this is an experimental technology, that wind and solar, they seem to think are experimental technologies. Well, in Denmark, already 88% of all electricity comes from renewables, and most of that is from wind. In South Australia, 74% last year of all electricity generation was from wind and solar. Most of the solar was rooftop solar as well. In Scotland, 62% of all electricity generation is renewable, mostly wind, but they generate a lot more electricity than they use, and they export the difference to England. And if we actually look at Scottish electricity consumption, they are generating from renewables the equivalent of 113% of electricity from renewables, mostly wind. So they can do that because the difference is exported. So this is happening in Australia and around the world, in some places, not all places. And Australia is blessed with a huge diversity of renewable energy sources, solar and wind. We have some bioenergy in the residues of the sugarcane industry, for example, in Queensland. We have limited hydro, and then there's a few technologies that are not really fully commercial. Wave power, tidal current, and in Australia, geothermal power. Geothermal power is commercial around the world in places where hot steam comes to the surface. New Zealand, Iceland, parts of California. But in Australia, we don't have that. We have to tap hot rocks deep down, and that is an expensive and difficult task, and that has not become commercial yet in Australia. But nevertheless, we have a huge range of renewable technologies, potentially. So what does government have to do to actually ensure that we can make this energy transition to 100% renewables. We won't need any fossil fuels anymore. For 100% renewable electricity, we need to fund the infrastructure, just like we funded the infrastructure for coal-fired electricity in the past. We do need new transmission lines, some, but so would nuclear if it were ever, God forbid, introduced in this country. The nuclear people say, oh, solar and wind need some new transmission lines. But the transmission system in this country has been neglected for decades. And if nuclear came in, we would still need new transmission lines, particularly interstate ones. We need to temporarily give subsidies to energy storage, whether it's in batteries or pumped hydro, temporarily, to get the whole thing moving. We need to remove the existing subsidies to fossil fuels. And when you hear people attack renewable energy and say it's subsidised, fossil fuels in Australia are getting approximately $14 billion a year in subsidies from federal and state governments. And that's mostly multinational corporations owned overseas. In the transport area, we need to expand public transport in our cities and cycleways and pedestrian areas. We need to integrate urban planning with transport planning. In Sydney, if you go out on the train on the Richmond line, you'll see all these stations where there are about 6 houses. And if you drive 10 kilometres away from the station, you'll see a new suburban development. It's utterly crazy. There's no coordination between urban planning and, well, there is some, but there is inadequate. We need to set fuel efficiency mandates on fossil fuel vehicles, which makes them more expensive, so that we can build a network of charging points for electric vehicles. I bought my electric car, which is not a Tesla, last week, so I wasn't confident about charging it on this journey, so I still came down in my old Mitsubishi Mirage, which is pretty fuel efficient anyway. But once I sort out the charging apps and all that, then I can sell the old car. Okay, so there's certain obvious things, and one policy that would assist everything would be to put a price on carbon, which the Citizens' Climate Lobby is strongly supporting. But that seems to be anathema in this country. You know, tax has become a dirty word, and yet tax is what provides all the facilities that the government provides for us. And we can see the need for it when we look at what's happening in the former United States, now the disunited States, which sadly is rapidly falling apart thanks to Trump and his gang. And you can see the destruction of government roles in environment, in transportation, in health, in education. It's all been torn apart right now. Tax, in theory, tax is what pays for it, although with the insights of modern monetary theory, those of us who are aware of that know that tax doesn't actually pay for it at a federal level. Government actually creates the funding that is necessary, and the tax is there to give government dollars a validity, something that people have to pay their tax in. Okay, but that's another matter. I won't go into that, but if you've seen the film Finding the Money, starring economist Stephanie Kelton, you would know all about this. Okay, so energy efficiency, it's not just renewable energy. Using energy more efficiently is vitally important. For those who are renting accommodation, there are many things that can be done. Buying appliances with high energy ratings, you pay a bit more up front, but you save much more over the lifetime of the appliance. Low flow shower head saves hot water, which saves heating energy. Efficient lighting, portable fans, portable induction cookers that you can plug into an ordinary power point. You can get all all these things. If one is lucky enough to be a homeowner, there's a lot more we can do. Insulating our homes, heat pump, hot water or solar hot water, ceiling fans, and so on. I won't go into that in detail because that's another story. But again, the social justice issue is really important, that we need governments, we need to push our governments to give assistance in retraining and relocation and pensions for fossil fuel workers who get displaced from their jobs. And it's happening in Germany, it's happening in Spain, but in Australia, our governments are still under the tyranny of a extreme form of capitalism called neoliberalism, which says governments should play a very small role, leave everything to the market. It's complete nonsense. It doesn't work. We saw that during the global financial crisis. Australian government created $300 billion and then spent it to keep the economy afloat, and it worked. And it didn't at that time create inflation either. Similarly, during the COVID pandemic, governments created huge amounts of money and spent them to try and keep things going successfully. So, and finally, in terms of social justice, we need government assistance to throw over neoliberalism and actually give incentives to create clean jobs in the fossil fuel areas and in other areas that are disadvantaged by the transition. Because transitions always disadvantage some people. Okay, now, what we're up against is the political power of vested interests. The technology part is straightforward. If we simply applied all the technologies we have now, we could, over a period of 15 years or so, remove 75% of all Australia's greenhouse gas emissions. And all we have to do is work on the problem of producing green hydrogen and so on. So what we're facing now, and we can see it in the forthcoming election, is the power of vested interests who do not wish to see a sustainable energy future based on renewable energy and energy efficiency and fairness. So we have this claim of nuclear energy will be introduced. It may never be introduced, but it's a very cunning political ploy, because what it does is, as intended, I believe, create uncertainty for investors in renewable energy. That's the main benefit for those who are pushing nuclear power. It may never be built. It's so expensive, but we'll talk more about that in a moment. One of the things that those who do not wish to see the clean, renewable energy transition take place is to spread myths in the community. And they have the Murdoch press, which is very keen to help them do that. And they even have the ABC who feels it has to give equal time to the most ridiculous claims alongside the claims, the understanding of science and technology and basic economics. So I'll just give you a few examples. On my personal website, which is simply markdiesendorf.com, I've listed 15 energy myths and given brief refutations, but I'll just mention a couple, maybe 4, but talk about 2 of them. The first one, you've probably heard time and again. Renewable energy is, they claim, too diffuse to run in an industrial society. They claim it needs too much land. All right, let's have a look at that. It's simply not true. A wind farm does indeed span quite a lot of land, usually farming land, but the land it actually occupies is maybe 1 or 2% of that land. It's occupied by the wind turbines and the access roads and the substation. So cows continue to graze very happily, as far as I can determine, between the wind turbines. The farming, almost all agriculture can continue. Offshore wind farm occupies no land, and there's not a shred of evidence to support the claims of those in the Illawarra region and the Central Coast that an offshore wind farm is somehow going to terrify whales and other creatures. I mean, it really is weird. You couldn't, all energy sources have some environmental impacts, but you really couldn't do much better than offshore wind. But anyway, for solar does occupy more area, and as a result, what's happening is that the solar farms are now, many of them are being lifted up a bit off the ground so that sheep can shelter underneath them, and the initial reports are that the wool productivity is actually going up. In China, that top left picture is from China, they're pushing up the solar panels so high in some farms that they can plant horticulture, and in some cases it's economic for them to push them even higher and bring in harvesters underneath the solar farms. And this is all happening now, although I haven't seen those harvesters yet in Australia, and that's called agrivoltaics, and it gives farmers an income during periods of drought when they're getting nothing off their land, sadly, but they're getting renewable, except no crops off their land, but they're getting renewable energy. So the land area thing is a myth, and it really is grossly misleading. The second myth, which I'm sure you've all heard, is the claim that we all need so-called baseload power stations. These are power stations, the old-fashioned coal in Australia that run allegedly 24/7, 7 days a week, except when they break down or have planned maintenance. And the focus is, of course, on baseload power stations that are coal or nuclear by those who want to push them. Although, of course, in Tasmania, we have so much hydro that it provides baseload continuous power and also the peaks. The problem with coal and nuclear, those baseload power stations, is that they are baseload. They're not flexible enough in operations to deal with the peaks in demand or the troughs in supply, the fluctuations in wind and solar. That's why in the old-fashioned electricity systems, they used to have coal running the base, and on the peak they would have flexible power stations, hydroelectric power and gas turbines. So let's have a look at the arguments. I've had to put these down as a series of points. The first thing to know is that in Australia we used to have 85% or more of our electrical energy provided by coal. It really was the base. It used to be very cheap, except that now all the old coal-fired power stations are collapsing and it's not cheap to keep them running. So from 85%, last year coal supplied 54.5%. Coal is declining in Australia. Baseload coal is declining because wind and solar are growing. South Australia, as I mentioned before, generates nearly 3/4 of its annual electricity from variable renewables, wind and solar, without a single baseload power station. Now I have to be very careful here because back in the dim distant past, a gas-fired power station called Torrens Island was built in South Australia as a baseload gas-fired power station because at that time they had a lot of gas, so they could afford to burn it continuously. Right now, Torrens Island is on its last legs. It hasn't been operated as baseload for several years, and yet the South Australian grid is highly reliable. The plan is for both the former Labor government in South Australia and the present Liberal government in South Australia to go to 100% renewables by 2028.
Currently Labor in South Australia.
Oh, sorry, the other way round. Yeah, okay. But you're right. Thank you for the correction. But the main point is that both major political parties support going to 100% renewables, and they're pretty close to actually getting it. I've already mentioned Denmark. It used to have coal providing most of its electricity. Last year, coal was down to 8% of generation. It has loads of wind. It does also burn agricultural residues as a supplement, and it has a microscopic amount of solar. As you can imagine, Denmark in winter doesn't have a great deal of sunshine. So this whole baseload myth is indeed a myth. The actual observations are confirmed by work that my colleagues and I at the University of New South Wales did. We did a series of computer simulations of the Australian national electricity market running on 100% renewables. We used real hourly data, or half-hourly in some cases, on wind, on sun, and on demand for periods up to 6 years. And we found that we could run the system entirely on renewables, but there were a few rare periods of maybe 5 days when the wind wasn't great over much of the country and it was overcast. And in German they call these Dunkelflaute, dark doldrums. These are rare events. And we filled that gap at the time with gas turbines, which are jet engines basically, and they're very flexible. If you've seen them at the airport, they can start up and come to full power in about 10 minutes, unlike a coal station, which takes 24 hours or more. And they can be fueled on green fuels as well as fossil fuels. Okay, they don't have to be fueled. They're called gas turbines, but they don't have to be fueled on fossil gas. You can fuel them on biofuels. And in fact, if you've travelled in recent years on Qantas, they won't tell you, but occasionally one of their engines will be fueled on some biofuel because they are experimenting and they can do that safely. So the Dunkelflaute periods, these rare periods, can be supplied by having a few gas turbines in reserve. Now, gas turbines are jet engines. They're mass-produced. They are cheap to buy. I mean, you and I wouldn't find them cheap, but compared with a coal or nuclear station, they are very cheap, $1,000 a kilowatt. And even if they're not operated, because they won't be operated in some years, but they're there as a kind of reliability insurance just to fill those rare gaps of several days when there may be both low wind and low sunshine. And when I say low sunshine, there are no conditions in which solar stops generating. I mean, when it's raining at my place, I'm still getting a fraction, not full power, but I'm getting a good fraction that's enough to power my house while it rains for several days. So it's doable. So this baseload thing is a myth again. We don't need baseload power stations. It's old-fashioned ideas that need to be discarded. What we need is wind and solar and flexible additional things, whether they are batteries or pumped hydro or compressed air or lifting weights or whatever. Left-hand side is, down the bottom is a battery, or actually is my battery, and the inverter is up above and the solar's on the roof. On the right-hand side, you get a large-scale battery system, a utility system. For medium, battery storage becomes very expensive if you want to store energy more than several hours. So then you need to go to hydro or pumped hydro. We call that gravitational energy. And pumped hydro, well, you know, ordinary hydro is water flows down from downhill. It turns a turbine, which generates electricity. Pumped hydro is when you've got lots of wind and solar, you use that excess electricity to pump water uphill from a lower reservoir to a higher reservoir. And then when you have a shortage of wind and sunshine or lots of demand for power, you let the water run back down to the lower reservoir, generating power on the way down. Bottom left is the Kidston mine in Queensland. It's a disused mine and it has 2 reservoirs that were built as part of the mining operation, and they're at different levels. So this is being converted into a pumped hydro system. It has a solar farm as well. Even if you've got no water at all, you can lift weights instead with excess energy and then use the controlled falling weights to generate power. You don't need to go through the detail. So this is just one of the graphs in the CSIRO Gen Cost report that looks at the costs of the different electricity generating technologies. And solar and wind are down here. Nuclear up here. And even if you put in storage and new transmission lines with the solar, you're still down there. And I mean, this is the most scrutinised study ever in this country, and it stands up. We won't go into details now. And the nuclear in this diagram is hypothetical because it couldn't be operating by 2030 anyway. This is a diagram for 2030, but 2040 would be the earliest for nuclear. The slideshow, we can make that available if people want to get it. I'm quite happy for the PDF version. Okay, I've got to mention the Frontier Economics report. This was done for the Coalition, and it claims that nuclear is cheaper than renewables. And I want to just show you a few tricks of how they actually did this. The first trick is pretty obvious. They chose a capital cost for nuclear power, which is much lower than the existing capital costs of new nuclear power stations being built in Finland, in France, and the Hinkley C in the United Kingdom and in the United States. They just chose a cheaper level, but that wasn't the crowning glory of their assumptions, because what they were doing is they weren't just comparing the costs of the technologies, they were comparing 2 scenarios. Their scenario, the Frontier scenario, the Coalition scenario in this case, compared with the Australian Energy Market Operators scenario for a renewable transition. And the way in which Frontier, the main way that they got a cheaper cost, was that they assumed that there would be far less electricity generated in their scenario. So of course it's going to be cheaper if you don't generate more than a fraction of the electricity. And they assumed this because they assumed that electric cars will play a minor role in the future, and electric heating will not, the transition to electric heating will not take place, and greenhouse gas emissions will go up enormously. So basically they're comparing apples with shoes. They're comparing a reasonable scenario, the Australian Energy Market Operator scenario, for a transition to renewables, with a different scenario which involves much less electricity generation. And you see, the cunning of it was, okay, so there's less electricity, that means there's much more transportation fuel used, oil and gas for heating, but they don't cost that. They only cost the electricity costs. So the whole energy system under their scenario, under the Frontier scenario, costs much more, far more. But because they've reduced the electricity generation and they don't care about climate change, it comes out they can do this trick of producing the lower figure. They do other things too, because they're going to have to assume that old coal-fired power stations are going to be maintained until the 2040s, when and if nuclear finally appears, and they assume that the cost of doing that is negligible. Yet they're breaking down all the time right now, and the cost of maintaining them is huge, hundreds of millions of dollars per power station per year. They also ignore the very high additional costs of backing up nuclear. all the talk is about backing up solar and wind, but the nuclear power, because there are no commercially available small nuclear power stations, small modular power stations, the propaganda doesn't exist, they don't exist. It means that nuclear power stations are much bigger, the nuclear reactors are much bigger in generating capacity than any of the existing coal-fired generators. And if they go down, and they do from time to time, they will need lots of backup. And they're not costing that. And CSIRO didn't try and cost that either, by the way. It's tricky, but it's huge. So, and of course they ignore the cost of the existing emissions. So the frontier economics scenario, in my personal view, is a fraud and should not be taken seriously. All right, now another myth that needs to be looked at is this notion that we need to keep fracking for gas in this country. But the problem is, Australia is one of the world's biggest exporters of gas. We've got gas coming out of our ears. And the farmers are desperately, the lock the gate people are desperately trying to stop new gas fields being developed on their properties because they do so much damage. So there's no shortage of gas. 80% of our gas that's produced is exported or used to compress the gas that is exported. There's plenty of gas. There's no immediate threat of shortages, although there is a debate about whether in Victoria in 2028, if the Bass Strait gas fields run low, there might be some shortage. But we don't need new gas fields to deal with that. And the other thing is that gas-fired generation of electricity is declining rapidly. Last year it was just over 5% of our electricity generation, and it is still declining because batteries are basically eating the gas as lunch, are substituting for the gas. So electrification, big batteries and high gas prices, they are the factors that are reducing the use of gas for electricity generation. Now at present there still are some important uses of gas in industry for industrial heating, and that is a more difficult thing to handle. But the reality is that we are using less gas all the time, not more. Now the coalition policy, and I'm finding it very difficult to keep up with their changes in policy on gas, but I think the latest version, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that they're proposing what they call an East Coast gas reservation, which means that some of the gas that might have been exported has to be kept for use in the eastern coast of Australia. And that might slightly reduce domestic gas prices, or it might not, but what it will do is undermine the transition in gas heating, from gas heating to electrical heating, to reverse cycle air conditioners. Okay, so now we come to nuclear power. And it is absolutely astonishing to someone who's worked in the energy field for nearly half a century and has every 10 years or so had to face this renewed claims for that nuclear energy somehow will transform this country. The first concern is my first concern is the proliferation of nuclear weapons. And this is hardly ever mentioned in the mass media, even by the ABC. But the situation is very serious. In the past, the so-called peaceful nuclear industry has hidden the development of nuclear weapons by the United Kingdom, France, India, Pakistan, North Korea, and South Africa. In the case of the United Kingdom, they used military reactors to produce the weapons-grade plutonium for their nuclear weapons initially, but they supplemented that plutonium with the plutonium that comes out of the waste of their first generation of nuclear power stations. In France, the military and civil nuclear industries are indistinguishable. They use the same facilities. India drew upon their experience with the Canadian nuclear power stations, the Candu reactors, to develop their nuclear weapons. In Pakistan, there was an entrepreneur, Mr. A.Q. Khan, who worked in a so-called peaceful European uranium plant, a Urenco plant it was called, and gained his knowledge of nuclear energy and how to make nuclear weapons in that peaceful plant. He went back to Pakistan and developed the Pakistani bomb. But because he was an entrepreneur, he then went to North Korea and sold his knowledge and helped North Korea to develop its nuclear bomb. South Africa developed their nuclear bomb in secret based on their peaceful civil nuclear program. They exploded, we believe they did explode bombs, but they are the only country in the world that has discontinued and dismantled their nuclear weapons program, which is interesting. Again, very few people know about that. I have to say that a number of other countries attempted to use nuclear power to develop nuclear weapons, but fortunately discontinued. And you can see the list there: Algeria, Argentina, Australia, around about 1970, didn't get very far. The whole thing was stymied. It started under Gorton as Prime Minister, and a change of Prime Minister to McMahon closed the nuclear program down. They started to build a nuclear power station at Jervis Bay, but they didn't get past the foundations, fortunately. Brazil, Libya, South Korea, and Taiwan. So that is, in my view, number one hazard, which is practically never mentioned in the media. Number two hazard, we all know about the disastrous accidents at 3 Mile Island in the US. It wasn't quite a disaster. It came to the brink and didn't quite fall over, but it could have been a terrible disaster because it was a quite a highly populated area. Chernobyl in Ukraine in 1986, a complete disaster. The International Agency for Research on Cancer, which is the expert on radiation-induced cancer, they estimated 16,000 additional deaths would be induced from the radiation releases in Europe alone from Chernobyl over a period of decades. Fukushima in Japan, pro-nuclear people are claiming that there are no deaths, apart from the deaths, a few local deaths and deaths from people moving house and so on, and the deaths of all the industries, of course, locally. We now know, we thought at the time that most of the radiation either just fell locally or was blown out to sea. We now know that Tokyo, 200 kilometres away, was significantly exposed they detected at the time, and it's now released, that very radioactive particles of cesium-137, which is a very nasty thing, had been detected in Tokyo at the time. The whole thing was suppressed until recently, until it was exposed in the Scientific American and then published finally. So, much higher than expected. I've got to show you these two pictures at the bottom. On the left-hand side, you can see the exploding reactors at Fukushima in Japan. 3 of the 6 reactors were operating, and they all 3 exploded. On the right-hand side, down the coast from Fukushima, was a wind farm in the surf at a place called Kamizu. The tsunami went straight through the wind farm, and it continued to generate until eventually the grid went down due to the tsunami. And when the grid was restored 3 days later, the wind farm was operating again. It shows you a difference between the resilience of the technologies and the safety. Well, I hardly need to say anything about nuclear waste. There's a third hazard. You all know about that. But you may not be aware that most of the nuclear waste at nuclear power stations is stored in these swimming pools, except you're strongly advised not to swim in them. And the problem there is that they are a fantastic target for terrorists, potentially. Some of the waste is temporarily stored in stainless steel casks, you can see on the right-hand side. The only country that is close to permanent long-term storage is Finland. They have an underground repository, and within the next year or so it'll probably be operating. Okay, I won't go into detail on this, but childhood cancers near nuclear power stations in Germany. Now, for many years there have been unsatisfactory studies trying to pin down whether people who live close to nuclear power stations have more cancer than those who don't. And the earlier studies were unclear, the data wasn't good, they were incomplete, the methods were unsatisfactory. A few years ago, the German government commissioned the German Federal Office of Radiation Protection to do a study of the cancer incidence of all children under the age of 5 living near all nuclear power stations in Germany. It's all and all, it's a highly statistically significant study. And what they found was children living within 5 kilometres of a nuclear power station had 2.2 times the risk of leukemia, more than double the risk of leukemia. These are children aged less than 5. And about 1.6 times the risk of solid cancers compared with those who live further out. But the important thing here is, because the usual answer is, well, correlation is not cause. So you need some additional evidence to determine that that correlation is cause. And the additional evidence is that the high incidence of cancer falls off. It doesn't stop at 5 kilometres, but it falls off steadily out much further. So you've got essentially a dose-response curve, right? If you consider the dose as, you consider the distance from the nuclear power station as a proxy for radiation dose, and it's quite clear that there is, this correlation is causal. And of course, the proposed nuclear power stations for Australia have a number of communities within even 5 kilometres. And I was speaking recently in Lithgow, and one of the proposed nuclear power stations by the coalition is to replace the old coal-fired station at Mount Piper, and the town of Wallerawang and several other smaller communities are within 5 kilometres. But anyway, the risk doesn't stop at 5 kilometres, it just becomes, the increased risk becomes less. Okay, so to sum up, nuclear is a bad idea because it is too expensive, it is too dangerous, it is too slow to build to be useful for dealing with climate change, and it is a very poor partner for renewables because it's not flexible enough in operation, like batteries or hydro, to smooth out the variability of wind and solar. So I won't go into detail on that because I don't want to talk much longer. I do need to say one thing, show this graph. Now, renewable energy has been a tremendous success story, but this graph, the left-hand pillar, is total energy consumption in the whole world in 2009. And then 10 years later, the second higher tower is the total energy consumption in the whole world in 2019. And the worrying thing is that in both cases, the fossil fuel contribution is still 80%. It was 80% in 2009. In fact, it was actually 80% in year 2000 and 80% in 2019, despite the enormous growth of renewable energy. So what's going on? What's going on is that energy consumption is increasing on a global scale, and renewable energy is struggling to keep up. And it's no fault of renewable energy. If we had nuclear there, it would be much worse because nuclear takes so long to build, it would never catch up with growing consumption. So this is one of the reasons that we can't totally solve the energy problem within the energy sector. We actually have to look at consumption, because energy consumption depends on economic consumption. And this is a very difficult thing to tell our politicians, that the rich countries certainly are going to have to talk about transitioning to an economy that no longer grows, a steady state economy. So I'm just flagging that. And that growth in the economy is both due to growth in economic activity and growth in population. Those two factors are driving up economic consumption. So I'll just add that. And then finally, my feeling is, and this is discussed more in my book, that the environmental movement has, without the environmental movement, we would already be totally doomed, I would say. But despite all the efforts of the environment movement, things are getting worse in terms of climate change, deforestation, you name it, pollution of air and water. And the problem, as I see it, is the capture of our nation states by the fossil fuel industry and other industries, very powerful vested interests. And by capture, I mean almost total influence on one of the political parties and very large influence on the other major political party. And this capture involves capturing the government, capturing the opposition, capturing the public service, capturing the media, particularly if it's concentrated like the Murdoch press, and capturing other institutions. And this has to be addressed, publicised and addressed. And this isn't just for climate change. This is for deforestation. This is for war. The weapons industry is incredibly powerful in this country. The US military-industrial complex essentially makes our decisions on foreign policy and defence here. The Australian Strategic Policy Institute is the main institute that advises the Australian government on defence and foreign affairs and defence, although sadly foreign affairs has become absorbed into defence almost entirely. The Australian Strategic Policy Institute is funded by, as well as the Australian government, the United States government and the weapons industry. Before Australia, I have to just add this, before the major Australian parties, political parties, the government and the opposition, made the decision to buy the nuclear submarines and join the AUKUS agreement, the Australian Department of Defence had hired for several years several senior retired admirals from the United States and other hired administrators. And we know this because of brilliant investigative reporting, not from the Australian media, but from the Washington Post. So the AUKUS decision was basically made by the United States Navy. And apart from the cost, it ties us to an aggressive United States that really wants to make war on China. And guess what the first targets would be in such a war from China? If you were a Chinese strategist, what would you hit first?
Pine Gap.
Pine Gap, Northwest Cape, Perth and Fremantle, where the US submarines were. Anyway, so I just throw that in, although I'm supposed to be just talking about the energy issue. But the point is that we can pick off, there's a famous picture. What do I need to say about that? Well, one thing is worth mentioning that not everyone knows, that the lump of coal was supplied to these people, whom you might recognise, by the Minerals Council of Australia, which is one of the main fossil fuel lobbies in Australia. And they lacquered the lump of coal so that the politicians wouldn't get their hands dirty, which is so powerful metaphorically as well. Okay. So whether it's for dealing with the climate change and dealing with the vested interests who are opposing action on climate change, or whether it's forestry or war or human rights. These are the methods, the ones that I can think of, used to capture governments, oppositions, public services, etc. in Australia. Political donations, revolving door jobs. Under the previous government, the Prime Minister's senior chief of staff came from the minerals policy of Australia, and one of his senior political advisors also came from the top ranks of the minerals policy. Well, I haven't seen an analysis yet of the present government, but listening to our resources minister, I would certainly think that it's worth investigating that. Concentrated media ownership, so the Murdoch press in particular, social media campaigns, think tanks like the Institute of Public Affairs and the Australian Strategic Policy Institute. Thank goodness we have an alternative think tank, the Australia Institute, which can speak out in the public interest. Covert lobbying, consultancies, we've had the consultancy scandal. Neoliberal economics that says leave the decisions to the market, which means leave it to the 1% that control the market. And trade dependence. So these methods are used to undermine climate action and social justice and human rights and world peace, and by combating them we can actually address all these threats together. So Chow En-lai is supposed to have said to kill 10 flies with 10 fingers, you've got a problem. You really should hit them all at once. And my proposal is to hit them all at once by forming an alliance between environmental groups, social justice groups, peace groups, and so on. And we're working on that at present, trying to build a bit of that alliance. And a possible common theme for such a combat, non-violent combat, is democracy, because all these actions by the vested interests undermine genuine democratic decision-making. And we actually have a very good group in Australia called the Australian Democracy Network, which is working to bring together different groups to support genuine democracy. So that's it. More of this talk is discussed in our recent book, The Path to a Sustainable Civilization. And my website has got a lot more information for those who are interested. It's just markdiesendorf.com. The I comes before the E, as in diesel. So think of diesel. So thanks very much for your attention. I hope we'll have lots of discussion.
Thank you very much, Mark. And I've got other questions, but I know that lots of you people will have lots of questions too. So we're going to have questions. Can you, I'm not going to say curtail your questions at all, but try to make them fairly direct would be great, because we've got so many people that I know who've got so many questions. So, you ready to go?
I was just going to say, with the power consumption rising, problem there, with the power consumption rising and at 80% and not falling off, whether you think the internet switch to quantum computing will actually ease that demand from the internet?
I guess I'm sceptical. Power consumption has to increase because transportation and combustion heating hopefully will become electrified. But what we want is the total energy consumption to actually decrease. And one of the things that we have in our favour is that electric cars are far more efficient than petrol cars. So a petrol car has an efficiency of about 20%, which means about 20% of the energy in the petrol actually goes into moving the car forward, and the rest is waste heat. While an electric car, you're looking at 85% of the energy in the battery goes into moving the car forward. But you've raised sort of additional activities, quantum computing, AI, all these will have an effect, but at least we are starting to see some of the servers being powered by renewables, which is something. But my concern is that even if we go to 100% renewables, if we keep increasing our energy consumption, energy drives the wheels of the economy, the wheels of transportation. It still means more environmental impacts, even if they're not greenhouse impacts. So my argument is basically not only do we have to transition to 100% renewables, but we have to actually reduce our energy consumption and still maintain a high level of human well-being, a higher level than we have at present. So,
just on that point about Bill Gates, apparently, I don't know how true this is, was looking at refurbishing 3 Mile Island because of the demand on the internet for power. Is there any credence to that?
oh, look, anything can happen in the US of A. Yeah, I think the impact of servers and AI has been exaggerated a bit in terms of their impact on energy demand, and certainly we're seeing a lot of servers investing in renewables, which is encouraging. But you know, there's huge differences between some of the particular technologies, and you see this also. I don't want to go off on a tangent, so I haven't fully answered your question, I know, but I've tried.
I have a question. When will energy start to go down? Like, as you were saying, as we transition from renewable to renewable, when is the time frame when the costs start to go down? Because that when the government keeps saying a mixture of coal,
Yes.
renewables and gas. And they say it's going to be a continuous future at this point in time.
Yeah,
So what's the question?
So the question is, when will electricity prices start going down? I think that's what the question is.
Simple terms.
And I think the answer is, and it's really unfair of the media people to ask politicians to say, which year will they go down? That's ridiculous. Nobody can predict that. But what you can say is that the main thing that is keeping up the price of electricity is gas. And the more we can reduce the use of gas in electricity generation through batteries and other alternatives, other storage alternatives, the less frequent we'll get these high peaks in price from gas. Because the way the electricity is priced at the wholesale level is that they basically put in the cheapest. They predict the demand 5 minutes ahead. They put in the cheapest sources first, so the wind and the solar, and then the next cheapest, which might be coal, and then and hydro, and then if they need to put in gas, then the final price that everyone is paid is the highest one, which is the price of gas. So the more the gas comes down, the more the total price of electricity will come down. It's gas which is driving it.
So would the wise be to get rid of coal and get rid of gas now, and renewables are, as we said, what you said, it's the cheapest form of energy. Why don't we get rid of the other two?
We can't get rid of gas immediately. It's still 5.3% last year of annual electricity, but it'll probably be down below 3% by 2030 as storage increases, battery storage, pumped hydro. When gas goes, renewables the price will dramatically go down. And in fact, it will go down as gas is shrunk in the electricity generation system. It's just the way the pricing is done. But there's lots of factors that take place. I mean, we used to hear from people attacking renewables in South Australia. They would say, South Australia has the highest electricity prices in the country. Well, the truth is, South Australia had the highest electricity prices long before it had renewables, because it's one of the smallest electricity grids, and there's certain fixed costs that have to be paid to run that system. So it's always been expensive, but it hasn't always been the most expensive. It goes up and down a bit, and the opponents of renewables cherry pick the time when South Australia is a higher price, and they ignore the times when it is a lower price, when the wind is blowing very strongly, sometimes in South Australia. Yes?
You have touched on the need for us to, in a sense, power down as well as, so become more efficient, I suppose, is a nice way of putting it. I think we've become so enamoured or captured by this idea of economic growth at any cost that we think we can just swap out fossil fuels and pull in renewables and keep growing. We're in an overshoot situation on the planet. So how palatable is it going to be to start getting people to actually power down, to reduce their expectations of this constant growth in lifestyle?
Yes, that's a great question. And it's a difficult one to answer. For a start, I don't think it's a question of blaming the individual, because we, as individuals, we're embedded in a system. You know, if we live on the outskirts of a city where public transport is poor, we have to drive if we're working in the city or in one of the sub-centres. If we live in rental accommodation and the landlord or landlady doesn't wish to insulate the home, we're stuck. So we need some change to the whole system. So that's the first part of the answer, that we can do something, we do what we can as individuals, but this is not going to solve the problem. And there used to be a sort of a myth that, you know, a proposal that we should all have a certain quota of energy, you know, like when we buy petrol, we would use some of that quota, and when we did something else. But that's not going to work, because it's the whole system that is the problem, and that has to be changed. So the challenge really is getting the information out to people in the face of reluctant politicians and very hostile vested interests that do not want people to know the actual situation. So, look, I think it's doable. It needs a lot of persistence. I mean, to try and change the system when major political parties just want to make a few little steps to show that they're doing something, knowing full well that those steps are inadequacy. And you can see that situation so clearly right now in the housing situation. Both major political parties are fiddling at the edges. We've got this massive housing problem, and young people who don't have the bank of mum and dad are in dire straits. And that's just one example. So how do we do it? Well, we persist. We try to find alternative media to get published. And, you know, it's becoming more difficult. Like, I used to be able to publish an opinion piece. 9 out of 10 times I sent one to the Canberra Times in the past, it would be published. Now, not a chance, right? You've got to be a former Prime Minister or a CEO of a fossil fuel company to get your article published, whether it's in the Canberra Times or the Sydney Morning Herald or whatever. So it is becoming more difficult, but we're seeing the rise of alternative media, and some of them are very good, both in Australia. Well, Guardian Australia is pretty good, but it still falls short of what's required. Their Pearls and Irritations is a wonderful online, daily online magazine, which takes a fairly radical approach to problems, and you can get published there. And there are various others that, you know, we don't have to go through. But it's also becoming increasingly hard to get published in The Conversation. And they say it's because they get so many submissions, and I'm sure that's partly true, but it's also true that most of the articles they publish are very low on any sort of intellectual content at all. They're becoming more like a newspaper, and that's how they've become popular. And I've published about 24 articles in the conversation over the last, 20 years or whenever since they've started. I find it increasingly difficult to get published in there now because they are becoming more, conservative is the wrong word, it's more right-wing really, and more establishment. And so that's the problem. But internationally, there are some fantastic independent news media. New York Times isn't bad, but it's published some terrible stuff also. The Intercept is really good. Democracy Now! These are funded by contributors. So part of the issue is getting the message out, to answer your question. And that is really hard. And part of it is having discussions in the community. It's very important. The rise of the community independence. Very important because their base is in conversation with their local community. The Greens trying really hard. They've got some really good policies as well. So again, I'm just talking around your question because it is such a difficult one. But I think really at this stage, things are so serious that people just have to speak out, whether it's about the climate situation or the genocide that's going on in Gaza right now.
Hey, more questions, please? Yes?
What's going to happen to all the petrol diesel cars? They just fade out eventually over the years?
Well, they do fade out already after about 15 years or so. Most of them have, are in the dumps and bits of them are being recycled. I don't think it'll be any different, but so maybe there's something more that you want to ask about that.
Oh no, it's just a natural phasing out of, it'll take decades, won't it?
Well, taking decades, it's stopping making new fossil fuel cars.
Yes,
that's what they've got to do.
It doesn't have to take many decades. Norway is a superb example. Just about every new car that is sold in Norway now is electric or occasionally hybrid, but mostly electric. And that was done just with a few sensible policies. Yes?
Have we actually solved the problem of how to dispose of and recycle lithium batteries?
Look, this is a much broader problem. This is a problem for our whole economy. The whole global economy is mostly a one-way economy where resources get dug out of the ground, they get manufactured into something, they get sold, they get dumped, and only a very small fraction is recycled. And it applies to batteries and renewable energy systems, but at last we're starting to see large parts of wind turbines being recycled. Many blades can now be recycled. Those who say, oh, what happens to a wind turbine at the end of its life? In most cases, the tower will be fine. It's the blades that need to be replaced, and the old blades can now be recycled in many cases. If they have a gearbox, that will have to be replaced, but many new types of wind turbines don't even have a gearbox, which is great because gearboxes break down a lot. So it's a problem for the whole economy, but having said that, you might think, oh, well, I'm avoiding it because there are issues with some of the elements we need, like for batteries and renewable generators, lithium certainly for the batteries, but that can be recycled. Copper, nickel, the rare earths, there could be a lot more recycling done than there is, but it needs to be done as part of creating a circular. I hesitate to use the term circular economy because deep down I don't believe that a completely circular economy is possible at present. For example, we're dumping vast quantities of phosphorus through superphosphate, partly, onto the land. It goes into the river, it ends up in the sea, and there's no way of getting it back from the sea at present. So certain things can't be recycled, and yet phosphorus is literally in our DNA. It's essential to all life on Earth. And it's being dumped not only via fertiliser in farming, but goes down our toilets as well. And again, it ends up in the sea. But we can do so much better with we call it in our book, a leaky circular economy. Even though we haven't got faith that a completely circular economy is possible, under the present situation, we'll be lucky for human civilization to last out this century. From the materials point of view, ignoring the risk of nuclear war, which we shouldn't really ignore. But with a leaky circular economy, our civilization could last for millennia, human life on Earth. And maybe we'll find ways of living in complete harmony with the planet. I don't seriously think that there's much of a future in migrating to Mars, quite honestly. But certain characters in this world would like to build their fame on that notion. But it is very difficult. Yeah?
I'd be interested in your view, which has been propounded in the past by Bob Hawke, amongst others, that the moral position for a country like Australia, which exports uranium, is to take back the waste, to reduce the chances of proliferation, given part of the argument is that Australia is the most geologically stable continent, and therefore we're in a better position to take the waste. And I think the argument sometimes goes further that we should take other countries' waste as well for the same reason.
Yes, there was a Royal Commission in South Australia that looked into that. It was the chairperson and the chief commissioner and most of the advisories were all pro-nuclear, with the exception of Ian Lowe, who was on the advisory committee. And even they found that at present the whole idea wasn't going to work at present. But look, a moral position is very subjective. Your moral, my morals are going to be different. My moral view is that we shouldn't be exporting uranium in the first place, and that nuclear industry should be allowed, nuclear power stations should be allowed to continue overseas to the end of their lives, and by that time they would be replaced with renewables. I'm not in favour of prematurely closing down nuclear in some places where it would simply be bring on more fossil fuels until the renewables can be brought on. So my moral position is no uranium mining, shut it down. It's dangerous, it feeds into a really dangerous system with the risk of nuclear weapons, huge nuclear waste problems, nuclear accidents, and potential health impacts, even if you don't get a nuclear reactor exploding. And by the way, they don't have nuclear explosions, they have steam explosions, hydrogen explosions, but then that releases huge amounts of radioactive material. So I respect different moral positions, but my position is let's not play in that game at all.
Well, on the same basis, shouldn't we ban the export of coal and gas?
Yes, absolutely. But it's a transitional thing. We have to consider the communities concerned in Australia. I'm not so concerned with the recipients of our exports. I think we should be exporting green hydrogen, renewable electricity by a power line to Southeast Asia. It's theoretically possible. It's difficult to do. It's risky financially. But, there are alternatives. So yes, we should be we certainly should be banning right now the mining of any more coal or fossil gas in Australia. It's because it's just feeding the climate problem. It doesn't matter if it's burnt in Australia or overseas, it all adds to global climate change. Yes?
You talked a lot about reducing emissions.
Yes.
land where we've already taken up 50% of the trees, we've got so much land unutilised and huge potential to go negative and start offsetting some of that growth in energy use that you need to talk about. Is it included in your book?
It's a very important point. Absolutely, we should be planting trees. We should end deforestation in Australia. Absolutely. Plantation forests need to be done better. A monoculture is not a great ecological system at all. So plantation forests need to be more diverse, but we're basically at present planting uniform monoculture, and they really are a bit of a disaster. So we can do so much better. Absolutely. We can't rely entirely on drawing down carbon into vegetation because of the increasing prevalence and severity of wildfires in Australia. So you can go to enormous efforts to protect or replant a forest, and the bushfire comes along, as it is doing much more frequently, and just wipes it all out, all the greenhouse gas emissions. During the so-called black summer, which really started at the end of winter and went through right into summer, fires that we had, the greenhouse gases emitted during that period were greater than the official emissions. They're not counted in the official emissions because of the blind faith that all the trees will regrow and reabsorb eventually the carbon dioxide that's emitted. But it's an absurd assumption because the regrowth takes much longer, so the absorption per year is very slow. I'm all in favour of revegetating the earth if it's done in a way that we don't just end up planting monocultures. Yeah, absolutely.
You said something just a minute ago which I think I picked up, that you kind of hinted that you did not expect humans to be around by the end of the century. I think you said that, or something similar to that. I'm not surprised at that myself personally, but I have 3 grandchildren who, if they reach my age, they'll reach it at the end of the century or close to it. And you also mentioned in your presentation the rise in energy use, despite the fact that fossil fuels have stayed at 80%, that the whole...
it's a bigger 80%.
It's got big, yeah, but the whole energy use has got bigger. So, is it just energy use, or is it, and you also mentioned population increase, right? So when I was a kid, there was 2.5 billion people on the planet. Now there's 8.5 billion on the planet. But those 8.5 billion are consuming a hell of a lot more than what my parents consumed when they were when I was a kid. I know I'm consuming a lot more than what my parents consumed when you know they were my age even. So what is the relationship between overconsumption and increasing consumption by us as individuals, growth in the so-called economies have to keep growing?
No, they don't.
And the possibility that humans, not just humans, but the whole ecosystem might be in dire straits, not just the climate, but the whole of the ecosystem might be in dire straits within the lifetime of my children and my grandchildren, and possibly even me if I can get another 20 years out of my life.
Okay, you've covered an enormous amount of ground, and I'm not sure that I've kept up with it, but let me respond to the first part. I didn't express myself perhaps too clearly, but I wasn't saying that necessarily the world would end in 2100.
Not the world.
Humanity. But what I was particularly focusing on the use of materials and the failure to deal with the materials problem, that we are throwing materials out, and in a one-way trip and we can't easily get them back. So what I was saying really, or initially, but then it broadened out, was that we will have a major problem if we don't move to a leaky circular economy as soon as possible. And it would be very difficult to keep an industrial society going to the end of the century. Not just batteries and wind turbines, but the whole caboodle. We really we cannot keep throwing away all this stuff and making it very difficult to recover. So that was the first thing. Now, gosh, you raised so many important issues. The broader question of our grandchildren, and I've got some too, I would put it this way: the most urgent things we have to deal with are climate change and the threat of nuclear war. That's as we see it at present. That's how the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist sees it. You remember the doomsday clock? They have moved it to 89 seconds to midnight. And they've done that on the and midnight is global catastrophe. And they've done that on the basis that nuclear war and climate change are the main issues in their decision. Now, they haven't spelled out all the details, but that's what they've said. And I would totally agree with that. I think we are in climate change is really out of control. There are a few positive things. First, we've got the technologies. As far as the technological change, we've got almost all the technologies we need. There's room for improvement. But the problem is, as I said, it isn't just a technological problem. We've got to deal with consumption and the whole economic system, which is designed, as I see it, around exploiting the planet and exploiting the majority of people. And that has to be changed. And there wasn't really time to go into any discussion of how to deal with the economic system, but let me just, as we are broadening the discussion, say that I would say the first step is to diminish the role of GDP as an indicator of anything, especially not an indicator of human well-being. We need a whole range of indicators, how much public housing and housing, public health, public education, public transportation, public parks, aged care, child care. These are the things that make the basis of, as I said, of a well-being society. And along with the discussion of the technological changes that we do need, people are going to say, well, all this change requires a fair bit of effort on our part. What do we get in return? Well, I would argue that as well as getting a cleaner planet that may not collapse in climate change, the human population should get these basics from government. Better public housing, public education, public health, and the rest of it. And the usual response in the USA, where propaganda for neoliberalism has been so strong, is, oh, you're talking socialism, you're talking communism. And the simplest response to that is to say, well, actually, look at Denmark, look at Sweden, look at Norway, Finland. They are a long way. They are some of the richest countries per capita in the world, far richer per capita than the United States. And they have much better social security, much stronger environmental regulations. I mean, we're not talking about utopias, but we're saying they are much further along the pathway for providing a better universal basic service for people, a better base from people, and that means there's less need for people to struggle for great riches and all the rest of it if they've got the basics. And right now in this country, we can't get any of the major parties to take seriously any of these fundamentals you could call them a social wage. That's what it used to be called. So instead of paying people in money, they don't need so much money because they've got the basics. We've got the basics in housing, health, education, transportation, and so on. Aged care, childcare.
What about food and water?
Yeah, well, that's right. Food and water. Oh, well, yes, you raised some important issues too. Absolutely. I mean, we have to... I'm actually chairing a public meeting in Sydney on Saturday on energy and water, but it's the same spirit in which you've raised the question. Food, again, we've got to look at very least modifying our agricultural systems to actually have systems that actually maintain the land. And many farmers I know are highly committed. They want to maintain the land. They see themselves as holding it for the future, but the system as a whole doesn't support them. And so we're coming back to this problem of how we change the system. And then that comes back to how do people have a voice in this whole thing? And one approach is to put more emphasis on community focus groups and trying to get that community input more strongly into decision making. And temporarily we've got community independents who are taking that on board, but we need a lot more than that, and we need somehow to make it a much more important part of the political system. So we're dealing with a lot of problems and we haven't got a lot of time. That's the problem, especially with climate change. That we don't know if we've gone over at tipping points already. All we can do is say we do our best, we've got to go and try, but we might have crossed a tipping point that
could be close.
We could be. So, yes?
At the public meeting in which you will be speaking on Saturday, do you expect there to be people under 30?
Hands up anybody under 30 here today.
We are all of fine minds. Yours is finer than a lot of ours. You're in much more contact, I think, with people who are our children's age. Where's all of this sitting with them?
Yes. Look, it's a very good question, and it's something we had a preliminary conversation about. Some people under 30 are very active, but most of them will not come to this kind of meeting, I fear. It's a different style. I'm thinking of the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, Australian Youth Climate, AYCC. I think they have something like 200,000 young people on their email list. They run training sessions on non-violent social change and a whole range of things. It's a different world. I only know about it because I'm a very tiny donor to them, and so I get their newsletter, their emails, but I'm very impressed with what they do. And it's an online community, but they also have events where they come face to face. So that's one example. So yes, look, there are usually just a few young people who come to these meetings, but I think it's very important that the people here, if you feel that there's something to pass on, that you pass it on to your children and grandchildren and friends. It is a challenge but there are different. Now, some people are more experienced in handling social media, for example, than I am, but again, that's another area where young people are very active. So when I look at the Australian Youth Climate Coalition, I feel optimistic that, and at some of the public demonstrations that we have, there are a lot of young people come out to those. They like to participate physically, really to be there. So yeah, I wouldn't write them off.
And also a lot of the active demonstrations that you see out in the bush or out in they're mostly
Yeah, thanks.
The
Yeah.
big camp-ins and that.
Yeah, but Mark, how do you know that these 200,000 that are on their mailing list are all over 50?
No.
Like you're cheating.
There's just a few donors, I suspect.
I've been
You have to
along to a few of their activities, and they are real, they're serious.
Yes.
Yeah, they are.
Yeah.
Same here.
Good. Thank you.
I'm another donor.
Well,
Are you on their list?
Okay, any more questions?
You have another question?
Yes.
What about population growth in the droughts?
sorry, I couldn't think.
Population growth?
Yes. Population growth is one of the.
Should we reduce it or not?
Yes. Okay, now let's discuss that a bit more.
How much?
Well, on a global scale, well, no, there's a few things that have to be said before one can even tackle the question. The first is that the biggest contributors to climate change and to essentially all environmental impacts are the rich. So the top 10%, a study was done for Oxfam. In fact, it's done every year by experts. And they do it on greenhouse gas emissions in the world. And the figures, if I remember them correctly, are that the top 10% in terms of wealth are responsible for half of all greenhouse gas emissions. Right? Now, if you add in the middle group, the middle 50%, which includes, I suspect, many of us, we're responsible for 92% of all global greenhouse gas emissions. The bottom 8%, sorry, the bottom 50% are responsible for 8% of global emissions. So that's the first thing. It's not just population, but it's the population of the rich. And relative to Zimbabwe, we are rich. Relative to Bangladesh, we are rich. Now, having said that, population is one of the drivers of environmental impact. At one conceptual level, you can describe environmental impact as population multiplied by affluence, which is GDP per person, multiplied by technology, which is impact per unit of GDP. It's a famous identity called IPAT, and it's useful. So population is a driver of environmental destruction. So is GDP per person, and so is your choice of technology. So if you're using fossil fuels versus renewables, and so an environmentalist would have to argue that we have to deal with all three: technology, affluence, and population. But in terms of population, it really is the population of the richer people. The population of the poorest people in Africa has very small impact on the environment and certainly on climate change, on greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a little bit complicated, and it's also difficult to discuss population because certain politicians have given it an odour of racism, basically.
It's a touchy subject.
Sorry?
Touchy subject.
It is a touchy subject, yes. But Australia is a vast country, and most of it is unsuitable for farming and habitation. So really, the habitable part of Australia, you can sort of go around the coastline and a bit here and a bit here and a bit there. It's really misleading. A lot of the country is not suitable for food production. It's not suitable for much except, sad to say, mining. So population is an issue, and it has to be recognised that increasing the population, especially in a rich country, is going to increase environmental impact, all other things being constant. But my understanding of the data is, on a global scale, that GDP per person has bigger impact than population growth, or growth in GDP per person. If you talk about GDP as a whole, as a measure of of economic impact, then part of that is the population component.
Just to add to that, in the old days, when I was a young man, we had one car in my family, we were lucky. Now everyone, you and your mother, father, and your dog has a car. Like my dog does that.
Yeah, that's affluence.
That's cool. That's what I'm saying.
That's the affluence.
Back then we were grateful to have a car.
Yeah.
Now everyone's got a car, not just everyone.
Yeah.
2, 3, 4.
3 and 4 years.
Yeah, and I haven't talked about culture at all because we have been indoctrinated now into this use and throw away society. I mean, it's even possibly embarrassing to mention it, but when I was a young child, I still remember milk and bread delivered by horse-drawn vehicle, and if it was a weekend, my father would go out with a shovel and get the manure and put it on the garden. It's sort of unthinkable almost today, but there was a different culture. There was a culture about bringing containers. If you were buying bulk things, you'd bring a container, which we're trying to recover that culture, that part of the culture now. So, and it is recoverable, but it hasn't just happened by accident. This is deliberate policy of vested interests that want to sell more products. It's carefully planned, actually. So when we talk about misinformation, also it's really disinformation. It's deliberate misinformation. Those so-called myths I put up are really, in most cases, deliberate misinformation. They are disinformation. Yeah, and the people know. The people who design these things know exactly what they're doing. One of the things, all right, I'm just going on a bit, but one of the things that irritates me sometimes about some of my friends is they say how stupid those politicians are doing those things. They're not stupid. They know they are being told they're being funded, they are being told that they will have a superb job in the resource industry, in the Minerals Council of Australia when they retire as the Resources Minister. They're not stupid, but this is an ethical issue or a moral issue. It's not a question. Most politicians are not stupid, unfortunately. Even Trump. I mean, he has a funny mixture, hasn't he, of stupidity and cunning.
There's a lot of cunning there somewhere.
Can I just ask you about your group you mentioned about promoting democracy? Have they taken on board the Swiss-style direct democracy? Have they looked at that?
No, I don't think so. I think they're so busy trying to oppose the current destruction of democratic processes in this country. The political donations issue. I mean, we saw there, political donations are one of the main ways of capturing the nation state. So the solution that the two major parties have cobbled together, the so-called solution, is a solution which is going to make it harder for independents, community independents, to get into Parliament. That's not the kind of solution that I would want, and perhaps others here wouldn't want either.
Okay, any more questions at the moment? One more.
I was just curious about water because you didn't mention it in this, and I heard something in the last couple of weeks on Radio National where this person was talking about the challenge of, if we don't talk about any of the other stuff we're talking about, the challenge of actually implementing nuclear in Australia because we don't have the water. We're the driest inhabited continent, and we're bound with climate change to go through droughts as well as major floods. But we have no way of capturing that water, even the country that we use. So you were talking about Saturday night. You're talking about energy and water, and I'm just wondering if you can.
Okay, yeah, that's a fair question. In talking about nuclear, I just highlighted the 4 issues that I thought were the biggest issues. But the fifth one would have to be water use. But to be fair, a nuclear power station of a given generating capacity uses about the same or a bit more water than the same coal-fired power station. The problem is that there are no nuclear power stations available of the size of our coal-fired generators. Right? A nuclear power station is much bigger, so it uses more water. Even if it were the same per size, it uses cooling water because it may be twice the generating capacity. So you might have a 1200 megawatt nuclear power station versus a 700 megawatt coal-fired generating unit. So it's nearly double. So you can safely say the water use will be about double. It is possible to use air cooling for nuclear or for coal, but it's much more expensive, so they won't do it. So the water is an issue. The Mount Piper coal-fired power station, which is just west of the Blue Mountains, near Lithgow, it takes water from the Cox's River that is part of Sydney's water supply. And when we had the drought, that was using a large proportion of the inflow to the Warragamba Dam for cooling the coal-fired power station and evaporating the water. So, yeah, water is an issue as well. I just didn't put it quite up with proliferation, nuclear wastes, nuclear accidents, and health impacts on the neighbourhood. But it is an issue. Hopefully, in the future, if the transition finally goes ahead, we won't have any power stations that are combustion, that burn something. So they won't need cooling water. A wind turbine or a solar collector does not need water cooling. Okay? A hydroelectric plant doesn't need water cooling. A well-designed battery doesn't need water cooling. So the impact on water will decrease as we go to 100% renewables, which is great. But we still have to consider the water used in manufacturing things and look at that as well. And making some things requires a lot more water than making other things. And the problem is, again, I'll just finish off. Sorry. The problem is, again, this neoliberalism idea that we shouldn't do it, even governments shouldn't do any strategic planning, or communities shouldn't, because the market will do it for us. It's a lie. The market does not do strategic planning. The market does not build infrastructure. The market fails again and again. Markets have a role, but they need to be guided to serve the community instead of us in a situation where we serve the market, which is the 10% or the 1% or the 0.1% that actually control the market. So the economic issues, which I used to find very boring when I was trying to learn about economics as a younger person, and I find fascinating because when you think about better ways of doing the economic system, it suddenly becomes interesting.
Well, I've learned a lot today. I've been a bit alarmed as well. But it was good that we hear this. With the coming election, it's interesting to have that information just in case. We need to sort of do some thinking a lot more about it after the election. It's really nice to see you in person, in the flesh. The last time we had Mark speak to CCL was in a Zoom through COVID, and I showed him the bottle of wine that I was going to present. Unfortunately, he didn't get to drink it, but I'm sure you'll get to drink it.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you so much for